Today we have with us Dr. M V Narayanan, who has come to Palakkad for delivering the fourth in the series of Eric Hobsbawm Memorial Lectures, organized jointly by the Kerala Sahitya Akademi and the Janaavishkaara, a people's web portal. So, welcome Dr. M V Narayanan.
Thank you.
We have as the focus of our lectures a concern for the virulent growth of the right across the world, and placing it in India, we feel that the most violent form of the right is right in front of us. So, we have to address it both theoretically and practically. So, all our questions arise from that concern. I think we can begin with a broad classification of our concerns with the pan-Indian concern for a social model which can ensure ultimately the happiness of everyone. That is a basic concern. So, we feel see around us several impediments to that goal, including the violent onslaught of fascistic tendencies. So, how do you perceive the growth of the nationhood side by side and the growth of the fascistic tendencies along with that growth of nationhood, specifically in a cultural context which somehow is iconized as being very tolerant? So, how do you perceive the dichotomy?
This is a very large question, but let me start with your statement of the idea of happiness. Now, happiness is not an absolute state. Happiness is relative, and the question of happiness is something that definitely has to change in terms of the historical context, in terms of social formations, in terms of technology, in terms of the world around us. And naturally, if we look at if it is possible for us to actually identify the structures of happiness in different ages, they do definitely kind of change. As Dostoevsky said, you can be happy in this in different ways, but you're all unhappy in the same manner. What I'm trying to say is, in that sense, if happiness is not an absolute value, but happiness is something that is relative, and happiness is historical and something that changes, evolves and mutates over time. It also indicates that we cannot possibly have a kind of social organization, an absolute social organization, which is definite to ensure us as happiness. We are looking at the possibility of a social formation which can self-critically evolve, which can self-critically reinvent itself in a continuous process. And I'm not thinking of it merely in terms of a linearity, but in terms of sometimes certain contexts of betterment, contexts of divergence, etc., where the social formation is constantly under pressure from within, shall we say, to look askance at itself, to look self-critically at itself, and to create structures which are all the time reconsidering itself to make it better and better in terms of the available circumstances. Now, having said that, if we look at the trajectory of democracy itself, starting with the notions of liberal democracy from the moment of enlightenment and modernity, we find a very interesting kind of progression within that. If in the earlier instances liberal democracy saw itself in terms of the realization of the individual, the French and the American revolutions were primarily in terms of that. But as we go forward, in the first instance, the individual was seen as a homogeneous category. There was one individual who could possibly stand for all the individuals in society, and where the nation or the state or the social formation itself perforce had to have a homogeneity that is built into it. The earlier considerations that informed most of the attempts at formation of nation states, for instance, which were all based upon the notions of shared categories, you know, common land, common religion, common language, a common geographical area, etc. In all of them, almost implicit in those assumptions is an idea of homogeneity, where everyone is brought together into one singular kind of thing. But thanks largely due to a number of social movements, not least of which is of course Marxism, followed by feminism, post-coloniality, different kinds of subaltern movements, etc. It became manifestly clear to us, I would believe, that this kind of a homogeneity is definitely a violence inflicted upon society, and that we can't possibly speak in terms of homogeneity, but rather in terms of heterogeneity, that we are not all the same, that we are all different in different ways, and different in different contexts, different in different countries, different in different times, and that a social formation or a social system will have to take into account this possibility or the structural, shall we say, necessity of taking into account this question of plurality, of heterogeneity. The problem with nations, and the question of nations as you brought it up, the problem with nations or the nation states as they have evolved, or as they have been proposed, even theoretically, as well as, I'm not speaking of the critical theory, but I'm speaking of the way in which nations are legitimized and the practice of nations too. This problem of plurality, this problem of heterogeneity is always a burden upon the nations. They would rather, generally speaking, they would rather have a homogeneous nation, and a homogeneous nation where the democratic process is primarily geared towards the majority, and the majority, which has greater say, will probably decide the structures of that particular democratic setup. Now, this is a contradiction of terms, and what we find today, just as, I mean, this polar shall we say, tension between, on the one hand, the urge towards homogeneity and the need for heterogeneity or manifest heterogeneity, is what you find, what you think is really the central problem that is facing political structures in the world over. Look at Catalonia, for instance. Now, does Catalonia have can Spain really claim that Catalonia should be part of Spain on the basis of a constitution of which Catalonia probably was not a part? But then Catalonia, when it separates itself and goes another way, it is going to form itself in terms of a nation which is very similar to that of Spain. So this centrifugal and centripetal kind of tendencies,
Immanuel Wallerstein.
Exactly. It seems to continue again. But I personally would say, theoretically speaking, and with a lot of pressure from theory upon practice, I would personally say that those nations are best, which, or the urge of a nation, the purpose of a nation would be to provide as much realization as possible to the potentialities of the many. And the many includes diversity, includes divergences, differences, etc. So that is what I would look at as a possible thing. And quite tragically and quite sadly, what we find right now is that what I would call the third wave of nationalism, which you find in India, which you find in America, which you find in places like Burma, all over the world for that instance. In this third wave of nationalism, what you find is that the almost violent, aggressive, top-down kind of homogeneity being located and imposed upon the people, which creates tremendous problems for the populace.
So I just touch upon one particular aspect, that is about violence vis-a-vis happiness. So there are several within the given social organizational model, there are several institutions which limit the individual and also the collective in due course. A decent society, we believe that should allow this fundamental human characteristic of allowing the full blowing of the individual. There should be space for that. That's what I meant by happiness. That means trying to overcome the elements of repression and coercion and destruction that exist in any existing society. As a historical residue, it will be always there. It will be always there. So how do we go ahead, constantly negating that historical residue, and as you said, in search of, in the given situation, the best alternative? How do we go about it, especially in the context of India?
I would bank upon progressive democracy. And I know that by saying that I'm begging a lot of questions. But the real issue at stake here is that, see, we are sitting on a contradiction of terms. Every nation by its very definition is a nation which includes some people and excludes some other people. India is India because India is not Pakistan, or India is not China, or India is not Bangladesh. This duality of inclusion and exclusion, which on the one hand defines nations in terms of their opposition or difference with other nations, also seems to work internally, where in terms of majoritarianism, in terms of certain ideologies, certain segments of the population or certain, shall we say, communities are considered more national, are considered more definitive of the nation, and certain other communities are marginalized, are considered less national or probably a threat to the nation, etc., and therefore excluded. So this equation of exclusion works both externally as well as internally. And in that sense, the problem of violence, the problem of fascism as we see today, is probably inherent to the very idea of the nation itself, and it is getting manifest in the practice of the nation. And when you have nationalism, we're talking in terms of on a day in which you are remembering Hobsbawm, and Hobsbawm's famous dictum that it's not nations that create nationalisms, but that nationalism which creates nations. So the idea, the concept, the imaginary of the nation, which is what we understand as nationalism, that nationalism perforce functions in terms of exclusion. And when such exclusions are working, the question of violence is always almost implicit within it. It's only a matter of time, it's only a matter of the right circumstances or the right kind of situations for the violence to break out. Otherwise, it is almost as if, for instance, look at the Rohingyas in Burma, look at the Muslims, the Christians, the Dalits in India, look at the non-Islamic people in a number of Islamic states. In all of these instances, what you find is that the others are basically considered to be at the grace or at the mercy of the majority. It is not their right, but it is almost as if it is a kind of charity extended to them, that they are still being considered as part of the nation, and where, unlike the majority, they are constantly required to perform their nationality, to perform their nationhood, their loyalty, their patriotism, etc. They're constantly required to prove that they are part of the nation. So my reply to this is, and I don't have a recipe. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't have a recipe, and it's only probably through struggle. And when I say that it is only through a progressive, constantly reinventing democracy, what I'm trying to say here is that a democracy where divergences and differences are part of the system, or let me go a step further and say that a system which celebrates differences, which enshrines differences in its very system itself. The Constitution of India, for instance, written by Ambedkar and others, is a document which is almost in that vein, where it is assumed that any person in this world can become a citizen of this country, irrespective of caste or creed or religion or other persuasions. But the real challenge is to turn that document or such documents, such envisaged ideas into reality, which is what I would call as the struggle for democracy, which is ongoing and which is probably never ending. I hope it never ends, because it's at that point when mankind ends that the search for democracy will also end.
when we speak of alienation as a Marxian category, we speak of human beings becoming a cog in the wheel kind of thing. So Chomsky proposes a social organization based on the theory of anarcho-syndicalism, where free associations are given play. So what is your take on that?
The Marxist notion of alienation is definitely predicated upon a certain kind of economic production model. What Marx saw as a binary was, of course, the earlier system. One side of the binary was the earlier system where the artisan or the producer had complete control over the raw material, complete control over the system of production, complete control over to whom he is actually providing this to, in opposition to the industrial mode, where you find that the producer probably has no control over any of these. He is working as a non-entity in a large structure where the raw material comes from where he doesn't know. The process itself is only part of the one particular part of that whole process. He has no idea where it goes to. It's an anonymous market, and where he is alienated from the material, he is alienated from the production methods, he is alienated from the product, and ultimately, because his labor itself is not being paid the actual value of that labor, he is alienated from himself, he is alienated from his labor, and he is alienated from himself. Now, this idea, this Marxist idea, has been, of course, extended by existentialists and a number of other people, and even political theorists, to kind of grasp a particular predicament of modern man within modern societies. What is very curious about this is that this particular problem of the alienation of the individual has surfaced so severely as part of a system which originally and historically was geared towards or aimed towards the realization of the individual. What I'm trying to say is the liberal method or the liberal system, liberal democratic system, post-enlightenment and post-modernity, which brought to the fore, replaced God with the idea of man, and brought to the fore the notion of the independent individual, completely free of any kind of, shall we say, linkages or any kind of controlling mechanisms. It is that same system which has led to the kind of alienation that we are speaking of. And in this context, Chomsky's idea of free associations, quite romantic as it may appear, I'm a great admirer of Chomsky, especially his critique of the Western system and the regimentalism which is part of the state machinery in Western systems, as well as in other systems too, and the way in which populations are, shall we say, turned into willing consumers of this particular ideology, his notion of manufacturing, consent, etc. But in this particular instance, my question would be, who is a free individual? Is an individual a free agent in the sense of his being able to have full agency unto itself without any reference to any other kind of ties, any other kind of compulsions, any other kind of conditionalities which derives from the society in which he lives? I would be rather skeptical about such the possibility of such an individual. So my wonder is this idea of completely free associations which are not historically situated would be rather difficult. But at the same time, I would venture to say that this notion of such associations probably raises another kind of possibility, where one does not form alliances purely on the basis of preconceived ideologies or preconceived positions, but in terms of the call of the hour. It's a rather postmodern postulation, in the sense that it is not as if you are one single entity throughout your entire life. Your identities are moving or fluctuating from one to the other, and in terms of that particular question that you're confronting, it is possible for you to actually get an association with another individual or another set of individuals whom probably you'd opposed at a previous point, or whom probably you're going to oppose at a later point of time. So this kind of what one would call, it's not random, but it's rather, it's a kind of release from a very oppressive kind of ideological molding, which makes it possible for people to make choices almost in terms of the call of the hour or the need of the moment kind of thing. Now, how far, and the problem is this, even as I accept that possibility, and I think that's a very romantic possibility again, how far such a system can be translated into a political program, into a program which can basically question the state with all its power right now. And I'm not speaking merely of the kind of militaristic power that states have, but the entire system of power that states have. How far such a system can actually be questioned by this radicalism is a serious doubt that I have. I'm not denying the fact that, especially in the context of some instances like the Arab, Spring, a kind of movement within civil society, which has not been probably, as Negri theorized it, a formation of a community within the larger society itself, which opens up a point of political action. But again, if you go back to the Arab Spring, what you realize is that there has been very little continuity of that in terms of a larger political program. So that's where I stand. Yeah.
See, when Chomsky says that the power is localized in government and its institutions, Foucault counters with the argument that it's not localized. It manifests and operates through several other apparatuses within the milieu that we are living in. For example, the universities, which are supposed to be the grounds for revolution, the police, the judicial system, you name anything which represents human endeavor, everything can be categorized as also oppressive and coercive. That's Foucault's counter argument. So it's not simply, Foucault argues that it's not simply a question of countering the government or the state apparatus for that matter, but countering ourselves. So when you speak of fascism, sometimes you say about, and Sadanand was the other day saying, we need not look for a fascist outside the hall or outside yourself. It is within you and within this hall, within the given spatio-temporal situation. So what is your take on that?
That famous debate or dialogue between Chomsky and Foucault, I would tend to say that Chomsky and Foucault, even while they were using the same word, were speaking of radically different things. There may be some intersections among their conceptions, but I do think that speaking of entirely different things. Chomsky's focus is definitely, as has been his wont entirely, the whole question of power structures, how power structures function in terms of institutions, in terms of states, in terms of political systems, and how people at large are slowly accommodated into its systems of discourse or its systems of belief through processes of inculcation, processes of manufacturing consent, etc. Foucault, I believe, was looking at power in a, even though he uses the same term, he was looking at power in a much more larger context on the one hand, and much more, shall we say, incisive context. For Foucault, power is not something outside of ourselves. Power is not something that is exerted upon us by the structures of state or governmentality, etc. alone, but it is there in every relationship. It's there in every relationship And when I speak of relationship, it's a relationship with the state, with the society, with other individuals, with other communities, with the self too. So when power is located in terms of these relationships, and where every discourse carries within it seeds of the creation of such power. The most interesting thing is, according to Foucault, even a dissent against power or a struggle against power is also partaking of the same values of, if not the same, values of power too. It's not as if they are innocent of or benignly bereft of any kind of values of power. They're also part of the system of power too. So these are entirely two different things, I would say, and the kind of opposition that a lot of people seem to draw is probably not there. Unfortunately, I think the debate contributed to that notion that they were kind of speaking of the same thing. But if one were to look at Chomsky's notion of power as some kind of a subset within Foucault's idea of power, as one particular sector within which the Foucauldian notion of power seems to be unfolding, then probably this contradiction may probably disappear. But coming to our question, I think Foucault's notions are extreme. Chomsky is definitely quite compelling, but Foucault's is much more compelling precisely because fascism does not work purely through a public discourse. In fact, no nationalism works purely through a public discourse. The surprise with which a lot of us were galled at the way in which practices of a domestic nature, practices of a private nature, such as what dress you should wear, what food you should eat, what kind of food you can maintain in a refrigerator, which you would naturally connect with your private domestic sphere of experience. When it becomes a political problem, people ask this question, shouldn't there be a differentiation between the public and the private? The answer is no. Nationalism does not work that way, and fascism, ultranationalism and fascism certainly does not work that way. They turn the private into the public because it's a quotidian, everyday activity, the habit, the custom, the kind of thing which you consider so close to your person, so close to your body. That becomes the staple diet of fascism, where the belongingness or the sense of connection to that idea of the nation is constructed or manufactured through these practices, whereby you identify yourself as being part of this nation, and those who do not partake of the same practices are defined as those who are outside that definition of the nation. And when you look at it, it's clear that the structure of power is entering into a very, shall we say, a very domestic spaces. And if I may go one step further, the fact that today, if I may be much more concrete, the kind of messages that we get these days on WhatsApp and Facebook warning us of how we should be careful about what we say, because you're constantly being shall we say, not spied upon, but observed, and so you may be called upon to explain your activities any moment. This form of a self-censorship with the active agency of people whom you would call your friends, your well-wishers, that's the best thing, your well-wishers. This kind of a self-censorship is another interstice where power seems to be working at a very insidious, very internal, very fundamental level, and which cannot actually be differentiated or distinguished as different from the larger public discourse of violence, of aggression, of false history, etc., going on around us. It's part of the same continuity. It's part of the same continuum.
This is not my main question,
Yeah.
but just an observation taking from you. You said about fascism working very insidiously. There's also this observation that fascism is coming into our body itself, what you call capillarian intake of fascism. That's biological. A study revealed recently that we are taking in about more than 50,000 violent images before the age of 12. So that's why this capillarian intake. So in that space, how do a person's mind react? Aren't there chances of after this intake of violence, persons becoming genetically molded to violence? I mean, I'm facing the danger of being eugenic
Yes,
for that matter,
yes,
but
yes.
still.
No, I wouldn't be so pessimistic. The idea of genetic modification of propensity may be a bit too far-fetched. But the threat is all too real. See, living in a mediated society as we do, and we are constantly being bombarded with images, or we are constantly subject to this. Even incidents that happen hardly 10 feet away from us, we understand that in a mediated fashion. In that context, the kind of images that we are continuously being fed with do make impressions upon us. And when it comes to fascism, I mean, it's apart from fascism in a much larger level. In contemporary society, this is quite a true case. Milan Kundera made this famous statement that it's no longer an age of ideology, but more an age of imageology, which says that we consume the world, we understand the world, we experience the world primarily through the medium of images. Even taste and the other senses always seem to be kind of codified in terms of the sense of seeing, of sight. Sight seems to be ruling over the others. Now, coming to the particular question of fascism, what is interesting in fascism is that these images are very crucial in the sense that they're participatory in nature. They're not merely images that we look at and we pass on. They're not images which seem to happen away from us. They're not merely images that consume us. They're images which invite our participation in them in terms of what I would call large national rituals. Let me take the example of Swachh Bharat or the yoga venture, where primarily it is said that a lot of people participated in that. But probably for the majority of the population who did actually participate in that, the participation was through the medium of the television, where you had this grand spectacle of several political leaders in their funny attires doing this yoga thing, and the images of the broom, etc. A kind of large, shall we say, structure of ideas, structure of experience is kind of instituted there, into which through this process of sight you are included. And this inclusion, it is almost as if the image is not merely consumed, your nationalism, the fact that you're a part of this nation, is constructed through the medium of this image. And this is why, and let us face the fact that these are not arbitrary random images. They are images which are cleverly constructed with a very clear target, with a very clear objective of creating or whipping up such a kind of sense of belonging in the people at large. And that is where the insidiousness becomes quite crucial. Will it affect people? Yes, it affects people. It definitely affects people. And we have historical evidence to the fact that this does affect people. But will it affect people in a permanent fashion? To the extent of, if not at least genetically modifying them, completely transforming them into automatons of this particular dispensation? I don't think so. I really don't think so. I would tend to believe that the human mind, the human intelligence is much more capable than that. The simple fact that in history we are able to see instances where populations or societies which have been in thrall, and that's a word to use, in thrall of such ideologies, have disabused themselves of this and then moved along and then become more democratic later on with the experience of what they had gone through. So I wouldn't be so pessimistic about that. As the old song says, this too shall pass, but how soon is the question, and at what cost is again the second question.
Again, it's a very contested terrain. The role of the intelligentsia depends upon the side they chose to be on. That's another postulation. Like, do they choose to be with the laboring class or with the oppressive class, the people who are oppressing the laboring class? If they are with the oppressed class, then what the generally used term is organic intellectuals. So, how do we actually have a space wherein organic intellectual work, it's intellectual work actually, intellectual work is valued and brought together against such a scenario where what you call the insidious onslaught of fascism is happening? I am asking specifically about the alliances which we can form at one level, practical level, and the other level, of course, the theoretical aspects of it.
It's a very difficult question, to say the least, precisely because it's a question that has been addressed through the ages by several, shall we say, supreme intellects, including Gramsci. One thing is certain, and that's probably the point from which we need to start. In moments or times of crisis, as we are going through right now, in times of intense fascistic aggression, engaging in proper intellectual work is a matter of grave danger. There's no doubt about that. Because what is most threatening to such a fascistic machine is certainly not the possibility of people arming themselves with weapons, but people arming themselves with ideas. If you look at what is happening in the universities all over India right now, and not only in universities, but institutions and structures which are supposed to carry out intellectual work, is that a war has been declared on ideas. A war has been declared on thinking. Thinking is anathema. Thinking has to be pushed underground. Thinking has to be erased or buried, so to speak. And it is in this context that we are actually asking this question. How is it possible to actually create a space, a kind of, shall we say, enclave within which such thinking is made possible? Again, it's not as if there are recipes for that, but I would venture to say that such a possibility resides primarily in creating a space of struggle against this. And when I say a space of struggle, see, there's a problem here, and the problem is that on the one hand we speak of, say, people's power, where there are spontaneous outbursts or revolutionary fervor coming up, which would end up in the overthrow of this oppressive structure. On the other hand, we speak of the intellectual input into that, and where both are seen as primarily, the difference between theory and practice kind of separated. But I would tend to say, and on the basis of historical evidence, that these two can only go together. That it's only in the context of an actual struggle, whether it is underground or however frail or feeble it may be, viable as long as it is only in the context of an actual struggle, and struggle probably not according to classical recipes of the same, but it's in the context of such struggle that a kind of, shall we say, thinking of resistance, a thinking that addresses the reality of the situation can come up. Let me give you an example, and probably a very far-fetched example. I would tend to say that a work like that of Edward Said, Orientalism, would not have been possible without the Palestinian struggle that was going on at that time. let us not forget the fact that Orientalism was written at a point in history when the Palestinian struggle was probably at its highest pitch. I'm not trying to say by any stretch of imagination that Edward Said, living as he did in the United States at that point of time, and having a rather tenuous relationship with the Palestinian liberation efforts, was directly, shall we say, influenced by that. But there is what one would call a space where these different discourses have their space, have their little locations, and where they are kind of connected to each other. If you again look at a number of such instances, you find that the same thing does seem to work. But the problem today would be a question of whether the intellectuals that we have today, and myself included and a lot of others included, has the wherewithal to actually address the reality of the situation, informed as we are by earlier theorizations, but at the same time going beyond those theorizations and creating what one would call a more viable theory, which is, shall we say, to do with the present. What I'm trying to say here is, it is almost as if we require to be theorizing on the go. We need to be, shall we say, critiquing, we need to be creating, to be very creative with theorization and analysis on the go. It is not as if we can take structures from before, ready-made analytical patterns from before, and then fit all this into those. The case of fascism again, even while it is quite possible for us to follow the theorizations of fascism that we already have inherited from previous times, I would say that that may not be sufficient. With that pre-knowledge, we probably would require to actually address the concrete situations that are present here, and the unique, the specific, distinctive nature of Indian fascism as it is present here, and theorize on the basis of that. What I'm trying to say here is that the movement from a universal or the general to the particular is fraught with all kinds of problems. But a movement from the particular to the general, where you are firmly rooted in the particular, in the here, in the now, in the local, and then moving from that to the general, would be the move that would be absolutely required. Which means intellectuals need to be fully connected with the reality of the times.
This was one part of the interview which we had planned to have with you. The second part is your concern with the pre-modern rituals having percolated down to the present and having been used or are still being used to perpetuate and reinforce certain very anti-human ideological propositions. So, can you elaborate a bit on that?
A major contribution to the understanding of fascism in the form of the work of Roger Griffin, who talks of palingenetic ultranationalism, where he suggests that nationalist idioms try to revive supposedly earlier systems. Palingenetic means rebirth, birth again. So an era, a time, a nation, a culture, a society which is supposed to have lived earlier, been there in concrete reality earlier, it is being made to reborn, to be reborn. A rebirth is given to that. But the interesting factor of such a discourse is precisely that most often, I would say not just most often, entirely, such depictions of history are purely fictitious. These earlier times, these antiquities are constructions, fictional constructions. They're falsifications of history. They are mythifications of the past, which mythifications are basically designed to create a certain kind of structure of social formation, a certain kind of power structure, a certain kind of system of privilege and, shall we say, inclusion and exclusion, if we are to take the earlier kind of term, through such practices. And it is here that you find a lot of what one would call pre-modern rituals, practices being brought in. Now, what is interesting about this is, these rituals or these activities which are revived today, if you probably look very closely at them and analyze them, it may come to the fore that these are not really pre-modern. These have very little to do with the earlier rituals which probably were there. It is not a question of they being pre-modern. It is an aura of they being pre-modern which is absolutely relevant here. The thing is that the so-called rituals which are being revived, the so-called practices of faith, practices of community which are being revived here, are revived not for the sake of what they were before, but the sake of what they can do right now. If you look at them closely, as I said before, you will also realize that some of these so-called pre-modern rituals are very modern. They're constructed rituals. They're constructed into probably taking a little element here or a little element there to provide this notion of pre-modernity, so that that link between the present and that hoary past, that prehistoric, pre-modern antiquity, glorious antiquity, is clearly enunciated. What I would say here is that if the earlier rituals, the functional rituals of a pre-modern era were quite practical in nature, in the sense that whether they be standalone rituals or associative rituals, they always had a certain sense of community within them. For instance, the rituals that you associate with the practice of agriculture, it is for the creation of a kind of synchrony among the people, and the functional result of that would be the harmonization of the efforts of man with the cycles of nature, and the creation of a situation where the maximum production is made possible. They have a functional purpose to them. They're practical, shall we say. But here, these rituals are bereft of any kind of connection with practicality, and that's precisely what maintains them as rituals. They're rituals for the sake of rituals, it would appear, but they're rituals for the sake of rituals in apparent case only, but in reality, they also have a functional aim. And that is not a functional aim in terms of economic production, that is not a functional aim in terms of creation of harmony, that's a functional aim which has a very clear political objective behind it. They are rituals borrowed into, accommodated into the discourse of politics, but which appears to be apolitical in nature. This is why I have my serious skepticism about that. Let me put it this way. At the same time, we have modern rituals which are part of the activities of life here. For instance, the kind of rituals that we probably have when a person retires from service. It's a ritual. It's a ritual which we may think is meaningless, but it's very meaningful because it provides a closure for both that person as well as us in realizing that he may not be coming back to the office the next day. It's a ritual connected with that. It's a meaningful ritual closely connected with the economic and social practice of the day. But these rituals are not connected with the actual economic and social practice of the day, but they are connected with an economic and social practice which is in the making, connected with a political practice which tries to recreate in today a mythic age of the past.
So far we have been talking about basically philosophy and culture. So how do these elements actually reflect upon the economic practices of the present, what you call the fascistic state, what we may call the imperialist form of global intervention or whatever of the capital?
That, I think, is the most crucial question, we have been speaking of crony capitalism and the way in which it's part of the globalized system of high capitalism, etc. But I think that the connections between the current fascist system and another form of capitalism is very, very integral. It's organic almost. In the sense that, take the exercise of demonetization, for instance, where an entire nation was held captive by what apparently has later on become clear was a financial, blunder, something that laid waste the entirety of the indices of economic growth of the country. But the question really is, was it a blunder? It may have been an economic blunder, it may have brought down the growth rate of the country, but was there another larger perspective or objective behind it, where the sacrifice of a large segment of the population who belongs to the below poverty line or the lower income groups, so that it can actually provide fodder to the universal global capitalistic machine, the move on to a cashless system, the connection of or the bringing together of the wealth and the resources of the people into the hands of the very few, and which very few is not merely part of this nation but part of a larger global capital. What I perceive in this, and that is where the insidiousness becomes even more insidious, so to speak, in the sense that even when the so-called notions of Hindutva or of faith or of religion or a prehistory is being floated around, the underlying agenda, one would say, appears as if this is a process where an earlier kind of laissez-faire is being brought in, where the structures of responsibility, of accountability to the population at large are all slowly pushed aside so that exploitation can reach its highest level possible. What I'm trying to say here is this. It seems almost as if the idea of the iron hand in the velvet glove is being taken off. It's the iron hand. But in that iron hand, around that iron hand, what you have is the smoke of incense, the smoke of lamps, the peroration of yoga, the idea of an ancient culture. But deep inside is that very, very pithy and violent iron hand of global capitalism. Then a question would come up. What if there is a contradiction of sorts between the two at any point of time? Let us have no worries about this. Capitalism can even sell Marxism, turn that into a commodity. In the same way, capitalism has no qualms in actually using any quantum, any idea as a saleable commodity, or in order to further its shall we say, its market policies. The moment it becomes apparent to global capitalism that the brand of Hindutva or Hindu right-wing nationalism is no longer amenable to their interests or to contribute to their interests, let's have no doubts about that. The support will stop.
So Dr. M V Narayanan has pointed out to the task we have ahead of us, that is how to deal with the pithy and violent hand, the iron hand of capitalism, global capitalism for that matter, how to deal with it. That's our task, and we hope that Janaavishkaara, by having this interview, has contributed to the question rather than the answer to this question.